Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's launch of the COVID, Race and Ethnic Inequalities Programme, led by CODE, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity based at the University of Manchester. Welcome, thank you for joining us today for this important announcement and discussion and event. My name is Joy Francis. I'm Executive Director of Words of Colour Productions. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this launch. And it's a coalition between 10 universities in England and Scotland. And the programme will run over 2 years and will rapidly respond to the crisis posed by the pandemic and its effects and impact on ethnic minority people's lives. This innovative, robust and timely programme has 32 diverse researchers working on 10 work projects guided by 5 themes: mapping inequality, economic inequalities, education, policy, politics and activism, and health, mental health and ageing. The work will be informed by the context of Brexit, the economic downturn, and an increased awareness of ethnic inequality in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests and the rise of racist and anti-racist activism. The hashtag for today is COVID Race Inequalities, and you can follow the discussion depending on if you have to leave early at Ethnicity UK, so at Ethnicity UK on Twitter, and at CODE MCR on Instagram. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panellists. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Bridget Byrne, who is Director of CODE. Also Professor Claire Alexander, who is Associate Director of CODE. Dr. Remi Joseph-Salisbury, who is the Presidential Fellow in Sociology at the University of Manchester. Leon McKenzie, who is a TalkSport co-host, a mental health speaker on the international stage, and a former Premier League footballer and boxer. Rachel Yankey OBE, the former England international footballer and Arsenal ladies legend. Alba Kapoor, who is policy officer at Runnymede. And Marcia Willis Stewart, QC ONS, who is a partner at Byrne Pierce and who represents some of the Grenfell families. So thank you all for joining us today. So firstly, I'd like to address Bridget and Claire. Hi, how are you feeling? There's been a lot of work in relation to the research. So it's now here. If you could tell us a bit, before we talk about the research, tell us a bit about CODE.
Yeah, hi, and I'd like to welcome everyone who's taken the time to come here. So CODE is the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, and was set up at the University of Manchester, actually by James Nasru, I think in 2012. And we've always been an interdisciplinary group of researchers based not just at the University of Manchester, but also bringing in other researchers, looking at a whole wide range of issues around race and ethnicity and ethnic inequalities. And the interdisciplinarity is important because these are very complex issues, and increasingly complex. We're understanding the different impact of racism and ethnic inequality on different groups. So we're interdisciplinary and we're mixed methods, which means we use both big quantitative data, but also we see a lot of importance in talking to people and hearing their experiences. And we've always been committed to working with communities and campaign groups, and really trying to give our research impact in terms of communicating with people beyond academia about our research.
Yes, well, I mean, Claire, is there anything you want to add to that? I mean, CODE's been going for 8 years, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bridget's mainly covered it. I joined CODE quite late on, probably 2015, just before they received some funding to do work on institutional forms of racism and anti-racist practice. And one of the things that's been very interesting for me as an ethnographer is that CODE is very good at translating, making accessible to people like me who don't understand figures, kind of large scale survey information. And it's been really important, I think, firstly, because it maps the kind of increasing complexity of race and racism and how that plays out in people's lives over time. It points out the differences and the commonalities between groups across a range of social arenas, housing, employment, education, and so on. And also, as Bridget has said, kind of delves down into how that gets played out in people's lives, so what that feels like, how people experience that, and how people also can push back and try and transform racism. So I think that Code has been absolutely at the cutting edge of that historically, and we're hoping to build on, obviously, on that legacy in this next tranche of work.
Now, in terms of this tranche of work, I mean, that's putting it mildly, because there are 10 projects, or as you call them, work packages. And, you know, they are, I mean, they cover, and there's 5 themes, as I read earlier on. Everything around, for example, from policing. So I'm going to get Remi to speak to that later shortly. You know, the gig economy, culture, you know, cultural industries and young people, aging. Can you speak to some of them? Because, I mean, you could have had more than 10. I mean, how on earth did you manage to whittle it down to 10? And why did you choose those areas?
A lot of academics tend to focus on one particular area. So the advantage that Code has, partly because of its scale, is that it brings together people who have expertise across a range of different areas. And we've been very keen to partner with experts in universities and kind of third sector organisations across the country to enable us to join up different areas, because people's experiences aren't lived discreetly, they link up. So where you live will affect the kind of employment you get, the kind of schools you might go to, the kind of education you get will impact on the kind of universities or employment that you might be able to get, the ways in which different areas are policed and so on. So for us, we've always been very interested in what I think of as a kind of life course approach. So how do these things affect each aspect of your life? How do those different aspects interlink? How do they change over time? And I think the scale of Code enables us to do that quite well.
Well, the thing is, I mean, something that I want to quote you, Bridget, here. I mean, you said that we know that COVID-19 has caused more deaths among racial and ethnic minority communities, but it's also urgent that we understand and take steps to mitigate the wider social and economic impacts. And I think that the economic side is very strong, a strong piece, isn't it? Because you look at entrepreneurship and ethnicity, for example. I mean, why does it feel so important to inject and centralize that?
Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about the economics, I guess, you know, the headline thing that really gets a lot of attention is the deaths, which is appalling and a tragedy in terms of the inequalities in deaths. But I think the pandemic has also made us reconsider what's important in society and who's doing those jobs. And what we found is part of the reason for those higher rates of death is that ethnic and racial minority groups are more represented in those poorer paid, but very important. We've really realized how important those jobs are, which have been made vulnerable to the pandemic because they're frontline services that are done in person. And so I think there needs to be a kind of reckoning with that economic frame. And part of that is understanding those impacts. So thinking about where people are working, why they're working in those sectors, why they're not getting promotion. So why even, you know, doctors who we think of as very, well established in society, but doctors are dying at a higher rate if they're from ethnic and racial minorities, and why those reasons around promotion and moving forward. So a whole kind of raft of economic issues have been brought to the forefront, I think, by the pandemic. And what we're trying to do is track some of those processes, but also think about ways in which those inequalities can be addressed.
Claire, I mean, you said it's also important to think about how communities are challenging, because they're not just passive recipients of their experience, challenging discrimination and disadvantage, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the campaigns around the history curriculum, and also statues like Colston in Bristol, the whole movement, Rhodes Must Fall. That, I think, activism is also quite central to the piece, isn't it? The research.
Absolutely. I mean, just to build on what Bridget was saying, I think historically, of course, ethnic minority communities do very badly in times of recession. They're always at the forefront of kind of economic hardship. So we need to learn from those lessons to think about what we do going forward. But as you say, it's important to recognise that ethnic minority communities are not just victims. They've always proved to be incredibly resilient, to push back on the conditions in which they're placed. And employment's a very good example of that. We've been doing research on Indian restaurants, for example, and the Indian restaurant trade, which is dominated by Bangladeshis, actually come out of the fact that, you know, large-scale unemployment from the 1970s onwards, when the textile and steel mills and things closed down and they had to find new forms of work, same with taxi driving. So I think we're trying to find out what forms of change and kind of resilience and resistance will come through as they face very similar kind of conditions of hardship and deprivation. But I think also, and building what Bridget was saying about the National Health Service, it's important, I think, to see ethnic minority communities as part of the broader British kind of history and culture. So I think that the pandemic has made questions of race and ethnicity more visible than they have been for a long time, most obviously through the National Health Service, but also in areas like public transport, care services, supermarkets, all those jobs which people often prefer not to think of, have been made very visible, and the place of ethnic minority communities in the third sector, in food banks and providing care packages for people have all been really important. So I think it's a real chance to shift the debate more generally about, you know, who counts and who contributes in contemporary British society.
And also the fact that there's an assumption and even presumption that we're all aware of the ethnic inequalities, including the targeted groups themselves. And, you know, the fact that you want to produce something that will be accessible to everybody, isn't it? And I mean, you're in partnership with a range of organizations. I mean, I think that's the thing, isn't it? When people hear research, I think, how connected is this to real life? And I mean, you're already engaged with Black and minority ethnic, Black, Asian and minority ethnic organizations like, you know, the Stewart Hall Foundation, for example. And so do you want to speak about the fact that this is a coalition between 10 universities, but it's also a collaboration with the VCSE sector? Bridget.
Yeah, that's really important to our work. So tomorrow there's the launch of a large survey, which is really dependent on many different kinds of organisation in the VCSE sector, voluntary community groups and organisations. We've had a long working relationship with the Runnymede Trust, which does really important campaigning around these issues, and we're producing briefings with them, specifically targeted around questions around COVID. And we're also now, we're really excited with our new partnership with the Stewart Hall Foundation, which is, it's quite challenging for us potentially. It's bringing our work in conversation with a whole range of different people, you know, cultural producers, which as academics is always really stimulating and interesting because they have a very different take on things, and that really helps us refine our skills, if you like, in communicating those issues to a wider public. But if you're going to talk to Remi in a little bit, and his project looking at policing has got some really close relationships with different organisations, so that we're able, it's not just that they're sort of helping us deliver our results, but they're also helping us, you know, refine our questions so that we're asking questions that are important to those community groups and we can feed back with them. So in some cases, it's a very close relationship, and I think that really makes the research richer, but also more important in terms of what it can communicate.
Claire, is there anything else you want to add to Bridget's point? Because it's about humanising the data, isn't it?
Yes, it's about humanising the data, but it's also about making it count, because I think people often think that university research, think of universities as ivory towers, and in many cases they haven't been that for a long time. But I always think of Stewart Hall once saying in a seminar that, you know, if you're going to do work on race and racial inequality, you have to want to make change, because otherwise, I mean, you can't just collect data for its own sake. So I think for us, that idea that you have to make research count, but you can't, for academics, it's quite hard to do that if you can't work in partnership, both in terms of the people who are who you're researching, because they're the ones that know what that experience is like and can help you understand the questions you should be asking. I mean, as an ethnographer, I always think that's your starting point. But you also have to make your research help improve their lives. Otherwise, it's voyeuristic, and yeah, I think that's really not acceptable. So I think finding a way of shaping policy and making change is probably at the forefront of what we're trying to do. And that has to be done in partnership. And
then just before I bring in Remi, I mean, just sort of following on from your point, Claire, it isn't about extraction. It's not about going, like, if you think extraction, you think going to a dentist, you think of a painful process, think of something that you feel obliged to do. And that's not also what this is about, is it? And it's just, before I bring in Remi, I mean, we'll talk a bit more about this at the end in the summing up. How do you want people to engage with this? Because, it's not like we're going to have the launch, you disappear, just crack on with the work. I mean, I know, for example, another organisation you're partnering with is Creative Access. So, there's the whole creative industry, and creative industries are under scrutiny now from publishing Dr. Anamik Saha, who is involved with the strand in relation to creative industries and who wrote, Rethinking Diversity in Publishing. So, working with Creative Access and their huge database to get the experiences of the interns of colour, ethnic minority interns, in terms of their experiences, it's also going to be alongside a piece on policing. So, I mean, it's quite that breadth is there. But how, outside of the partnerships, how else can people be involved?
First, as the research goes on, we'll be talking to lots of people about the research. But for those who are beyond that, if you like, it will be about following us on social media and communicating with us about as we deliver the results and talk about the research we're doing, and engaging with that would be great. And perhaps the thing we're really doing a push in terms of engaging is people taking part in the survey, which is going to be launched tomorrow, because that is absolutely, we're doing new methods of contacting people to try and really reach out to a wide range of people from ethnic minority communities. And so we need people to respond and take that up and pass it on to their contacts, because the better picture we can get, the stronger numbers, the more power we have in terms of also talking upwards. We're interested in influencing governments and different organisations in terms of really reporting back on people's experience, and we need those. We need those numbers, if you like, to have power to do that, and to make really powerful messages to try and achieve that change.
I'd like to bring in, thank you, Bridget and Claire. I'd like to now bring in Dr. Remi Joseph-Salisbury. Remi, good to see you. You are working on one of the projects that pertains to policing. Can you explain a bit about what specifically you'll be looking at?
Yeah, so it's a work package with myself, Patrick Williams at Manchester Metropolitan University, Scarlett Harris, who's at the University of Manchester, and Lisa White at Lincoln University. And we're interested in people of colour's experience of policing during lockdown. I think a few of the significant points underpinning the research are the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, which drew attention to the significance of racism, but specifically to the significance of police racism. And one of the chants from the protest was that the UK is not innocent. We're interested in interrogating that a little bit further. Also, the lockdown, which gave enhanced powers to the police, and several human rights organisations warned that those increased powers would be felt disproportionately harshly by Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, and we're already starting to see evidence of that being the case in terms of use of force, in terms of fines. There's plenty of statistics out there to tell us that Black, Asian, minority ethnic people are affected more harshly, both before the lockdown and during. But we're really, with this project, interested in looking beyond the statistics or what's going on at the kind of everyday level, what those interactions mean for people who are affected by them, what's not captured by the statistics. And we're working really closely with some community groups, including the Institute of Race Relations, the Monitoring Group, Inquest, who are serving as an advisory board, to really make sure we're rooted in community groups, activist groups. We're being tested on where we're going with this project, and our vision really is to provide an evidence base for thinking more critically about policing in the UK.
This sounds like a movement. It feels like it's not just about research, is it? Especially in relation to stop and search, and the fact that COVID is just exacerbating existing inequalities. I mean, what do you find most unsettling about what has happened as a result of lockdowns and these extra powers and how they're being used or misused?
Yeah, I think it does feel like there is a movement growing, and I think that's partly why we're pursuing this area of research, because everything we're seeing suggests that this is something that people are really concerned about at the moment. In terms of what we're seeing, I think one thing that's starting to come out of the research already is that a lot of what is happening is going unreported, or it's not captured in simplistic statistics like stop and search statistics. And perhaps most worryingly, I think, is that the police were warned that the disproportionalities that we're starting to see would manifest if the police were given more powers. So there's an awful lot to be concerned about in this area.
And so just finally, before I move on, Remi, we've mentioned policymakers, peer organisations, community organisations, and so on. In relation to your work programme, how are you going to actually engage the Police Federation, for example? Because it's about the elephant in the room. You can't be talking about them, and the change has to be done by their institution and the government. I mean, obviously that's not the priority necessarily at the moment, but is that something that you have a strategy around? You may not want to declare it now, but how do you see yourself engaging with police and also the police officers who aren't happy themselves with this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think for me personally, and I'd have to discuss this with the rest of the team and Code, and I know Code has got a lot of strategies for engagement, but I think we're more interested in being in dialogue with the community groups that have been holding the police to account for a long time, trying to organise this. So we're interested in providing that evidence base and then allowing or working with other people as they look to press for change. But I guess in sum, I'm suggesting that the change, there are different ways we can approach seeking change, and there are communities that we can speak to and with beyond just the Police Federation.
Thank you, Remi. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Claire. So now I'd like to invite Alba Kapoor from the Remi Trust. She's a policy officer there, to talk about Remi's own research, particularly a piece that was done last year in relation to structural inequalities in health systems, with a particular, I think, focus on the NHS. You've listened to Claire, Bridget, and Remi, and one of the things I know that you feel very strongly about, we have to view racial and ethnic inequalities through multiple lenses. So do you want to speak to how you're navigating that with your own work?
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. I think, as you said, the work that we've done at Runnymede throughout the past year in relation to the pandemic has focused on COVID-19 not just as a health crisis, but also as a social and economic one. So we, in short, have found that COVID has fanned the flames of pre-existing inequalities in our society. Realities like the fact that half of Black and ethnic minority children live in poverty in this country, and that 14%, and they're much more likely to be represented in key worker roles. And of course, the realities of overcrowded housing and how that impacts sort of vulnerabilities to COVID-19, these have all been fundamental in mapping the outcomes of COVID-19, both in terms of health inequalities, but also in terms of the ensuing social and economic inequalities. So in July 2020, we did a piece of research with ICM that looked sort of in depth at the realities that were at that point playing out in the sort of first wave of the pandemic. And we found what we know so strongly now, which is fundamentally that the increased likelihoods of working in key worker roles, the increased likelihoods of living in overcrowded housing have had huge impact on the financial ability for Black and ethnic minority families to weather this crisis, but also, of course, how they can protect and shield themselves. You fundamentally cannot protect and shield yourself from a virus if you're not able to self-isolate, if you have multi-generational households, and if you aren't given the pay that you need to take time off work to protect yourself. And that's sort of the first tranche of our research, was sort of highlighting these very real concerns. And then in October 2020, we did some work with the Institute of Public Policy Research. And our research sort of underscored this, but sought to really highlight that these inequalities did not come out of genetic or ethnic differences, or for that matter, cultural differences between different communities. These inequalities were rooted in socioeconomic differences, and indeed in sort of the experiences of institutionalized racism that run as a current, not only in the sort of healthcare system, but also across sort of access to social and economic institutions in our society. And I mean, our fundamental conclusion was that comorbidities, so things like heart disease, diabetes, would lead to the Black population, for example, being only 5% more likely to die of COVID-19. What really underpinned the devastating realities that we're seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic are these socioeconomic and racial inequalities.
So the fact that you said 2020, we've now had 2 more lockdowns since then. What concerns you about the lack of learning? Because one of the things, we have numerous reports that come out. We know in mental health, I think, 80% of the recommendations haven't been implemented in terms of, the last 30 years plus years. How are we going to avoid falling into that trap, of once everything's done and handed over, to make these recommendations stick?
So I think, as you're rightly saying, we've been saying institutions like Runnymede, but sort of across the race equality sector, and also academics working with Code, have been saying time and time and again that there are certain immediate steps that need to be taken by the government to address the impact that this current crisis is having on Black and ethnic minority communities. And also that a new policy approach urgently needs to be taken by the government in engaging with these inequalities. And that really needs to address the institutional and structural racism facing communities in the healthcare system and beyond. But what we've seen, and as was highlighted by a Code briefing that came out with Runnymede earlier this year, is that instead policy approaches have focused on sort of ethnic, cultural differences, and failed to really talk about the sort of institutionalized racism that different groups experience. So for example, an unnecessary focus on vitamin D deficiencies is a really key example of this, vitamin D deficiency, there's no clear evidence of the connection between that and COVID vulnerability, but it's seen as a key driver as differences between Black and ethnic minority populations' experience of COVID-19 and others. And that's fundamentally wrong, and also a wrong policy approach. So we sort of urgently asked the government to take these steps, but they have failed to sort of do what is needed.
What struck me when you were talking, is about the role of the media, because the challenge shouldn't just come from organizations such as yours. that attention to detail needs to be made by journalists, don't you think? Because the messages that go out and that many people in the members of the public take is from the media, let's be honest, rather than the parliamentary briefings.
I think that they all inform each other. I think it's really important that we make these demands of the government, who fundamentally have control over sort of public health messaging and also kind of these crucial steps that need to be taken. But I think, as you say, what's also needed is a fundamental shift in public discourse. We hoped that happened last year with Black Lives Matter. We saw amazing sort of shifts and engagement from the public at large, but we need to sustain that change in narrative that really does focus on these systemic issues and the need for systemic change. And that is what this research program will do so well, is it sort of will ask public discourse to shift in terms of those longer term inequalities and that sort of focus, but also looking at the longer term steps that need to be taken to address these deeply held differences in our society.
Alba, thank you so much. I'd like to now invite Rachel Yankey to join me. And Rachel, hi, good to see you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm well. And I have had the pleasure of working with you and with your academy, football academy for young girls, and what you've done in Brent and beyond and nationally. And I mean, I want to follow on from what Alba, her last point, about how do you sustain the narrative about the structural changes that need to be made. And, you're here, you're a footballer, you've spoken out about racism in the sport, you've spoken about ethnic inequalities. You recently were part of a discussion on Sky with other women footballers about some of the challenges since lockdown. I want to, see what has struck you about COVID and the lockdown and the impact it's had on football, and particularly from the point of view of the women's game.
Yeah, I think COVID has really highlighted the inequalities at the youth level, at the academies of the elite side of women's football, to show that the structure is just not right, and we're not helping our younger players to become the best that they can be, because women's academies are not deemed as elite in terms of the government COVID rules, where obviously boys are. And boys academies have got the money. It's been going on for many years, obviously the business side of it. So the structure is that they have everything in place that you need, that require for the COVID rules in terms of staffing and doctors and financially, they can sustain that. Well, women's clubs just can't do that. So our players now, you could be a top youth international training with an academy, and your training has stopped and you can't do anything about it. You've got to go, and everybody on one hand saying you've got to train hard and be the best that you can be to succeed, but on the other hand, you can't go into the training ground. It's all shut down, and that's not the players' fault. It's because the structure is not right, because the doctors that work in women's football are either volunteers or part-time workers, and obviously the doctors are needed to work in the hospital with this pandemic. They're not full-time. The financial side of it, where teams may have a pitch or they might get a training kit, but it's not good enough. And I think it leaves us with a massive gap and a generation that are missing so much football, that how will they be able to catch up? Obviously in the long term, we want England teams and we want our players to be the best that they can be. I don't think that we're giving them the best chance. And that's what, when I look at COVID at the top level, it's great that the WSL and the Championship is still playing, and they're obviously, they're visible, they're on TV, the games are still going ahead. But further down the system, in the youth side of it, I think there's a real problem. And I think COVID has really highlighted that. And we can talk as much as we want, but now, once hopefully this pandemic is over, the action needs to be taken to make that right, to allow these players you know, I know Leon will go on about the sort of mental side of it, but allow these players the best opportunity, because mentally I can't imagine how tough this must be. You want to be the best that you can be, but you're not allowed to be the best that you can be.
But when you think about the pipeline, which is so tenuous, and you have, you know, as you know, the UK's first professional, England's first professional women's footballer, have been, you know, carefully built, and for it to crumble within a few months, and there not being an outcry at the absence. And also the key thing is convincing parents of children who are of colour, of different religious backgrounds, to play the support. Now, all of a sudden, it's almost like reinforcing the view it's not valuable, it's not important, which means that post-COVID, you're going to have to start again. I mean, when you started, it was a much more diverse sport. I mean, that's something that concerns you as well. Even before COVID, it's like there are less players of colour, for example. You know, what is that saying? Where is that coming from?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. There's so many issues, but I think one of the things is where we say we've carefully built it. I don't think we have carefully built it. I'm talking about you campaigning, players like you. Unfortunately, not the institutions. Yeah, no, I definitely think that there's, you know, when I grew up playing football, I didn't ever believe that there was a pathway or a career to be made for me personally in football. I just played it because I loved it. And then obviously playing for Arsenal and then going on to play for England, the team was diverse. I didn't see anything other than what I was used to seeing at school, very mixed, diverse area, obviously Brent, where I grew up in. And the England team was the same. The England team nowadays is not. It's not, and we can't, you know, we can't skip around that. It's very white, and that's okay. The best players will get picked, but I struggle to believe that there are not good people of color out there that are playing football. I struggle to believe that there's not talented players. I also struggle to believe that there's not many Londoners in that England team at the moment. I can think of one, possibly two Londoners that are in the team. I can't believe that in London, we're the majority of the squad when I was playing were from inner city London. Those players are not there anymore. So the questions are why are they not there? What are the barriers? I don't know the answers. I can come to a conclusion of where the academies and where the setups are being placed in very suburban areas, very difficult to get to. But there's got to be other reasons, which I don't know. But I feel that if we're ever going to move on and make a better, more diverse and inclusion for women's football, everybody going out there. We say that football is for all. For that to happen, we need to really, really investigate what is going on.
Something else I just wanted to touch on, which is the case in some other situations like school exclusions, for example, PRUs, people referral units, and in mental health in terms of some of the institutions that a lot of the time for you to get access to services you need, or the service that you are given is usually nowhere near where you live. So you have to visit your relatives in a home or a residential setting miles away from where you live. And if you're already, on a low income, that's a challenge. And I know that in football, for example, and other sports, but that a lot of the training camps are nowhere near where people live. And that's another disincentive, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you just look at Arsenal and Chelsea, Arsenal's training ground is in St Albans and Chelsea's is in Cobham. Anybody in a city, London, that's difficult to get there, especially if you're traveling there, after school. Who's going to, if your parents aren't able to take you, who's going to allow their daughter to get on trains, multiple different trains to go into basically the middle of nowhere late at night because the training is in the evening? It's it's very difficult, and I don't think there's enough support for that. I think if I was a young player coming now where my mum didn't drive, I would definitely struggle to get to Arsenal's training ground. And would that mean that a talent of me is never discovered? You know, and I'm sure that there's plenty more children out there that are talented that have just been forgotten about.
Thank you, Rachel. Stay with us. I just want to bring in Leon now. Leon McKenzie.
How you doing?
Hi. Wow, we're good to see you. Good to see you again.
Great. It's great to hear so many different insights into all of this. You know, obviously coming from a football background as well, so I understand where Rachel was explaining the issues that have been here for it's just more highlighted now that we've gone into, you know, this COVID situation, and it's over a broader scale of things. You can see what's really sort of truly going on from a deeper rooted issue.
I wanted to pick up on, Rachel, what you said, because all the things that you said at the end in relation to the pressures it puts on families as well as young people, that stress, you know, can lead to or create conditions for, you know, a stress on your mental well-being. And especially when you're very young and you're going to be in a minority and you're not getting the support, that's a huge issue that seems to not be being addressed, really. And I know that, Leon, it's very important for you. You've been involved in major, you know, range of campaigns like Time to Change, for example, around mental health, and you're a former professional boxer, Premier League footballer, and now you're a commentator on Talk Sport, and you've spoken about your own lived experience. What is coming through to you, because you're covering a range of sports now, in relation to sports people, and what is and isn't happening in terms of all the sport regulatory bodies?
I just feel like Rachel mentioned something, and Alba was speaking quite great about the whole situation, and I feel like the structure, just creating a different structure, because I feel like the one that we've been in, it has not been working. The mental health is going to affect everyone. I know we're talking about the ethnic side of things. I just feel like we are in a position where mental health we've got to understand that if you take things away from people, take things away from kids, you take education away, you take all these things away, fitness, things that help us grow as human beings anyway, it's going to affect our minds, right? So what I'm trying to figure out is that where, as a system, as a government, like, why are we finding it so hard to just address the things that are pretty much killing us? So from a mental health side of it, it's up there stats wise. You know, suicides, like, people falling into so many mental health conditions. But what are we actually, as a government, and I feel like we're trying to sort of tick one box and then something else will appear. To really answer your question, there's so many things to answer, but I don't have all the answers. I think when the main thing for me is to collectively come together and speak about what we're speaking about. You've got all different intellectual people who are, you know, all very strong in their field, right? And I think when you put those things together, we can only do so much. So even with this project and what we're trying to achieve right now, once that goes in, once we talk about it and we say, right, we tick that box, we tick that, where's it going to go from here? Like, so what are we going to do? Where can there be money that will go into different areas to make us stronger collectively? Black culture, Asian culture, collectively, what can we do to make things stronger. And it's not just in sport, it's within society. Like people, you know, are struggling right now. And obviously Rachel does a lot for the youth and so forth. And I know that, you know, even my own children have struggled from not knowing what to do. Uncertainty. No one's good with the unknown. It affects things differently, but it's like, okay, well, they can't go to school, so we try and do it in the whole homeschooling method of things, and that's not working out for every child. And I know that through my own children, it's not working out. But it's kind of just like, okay, well, we just got to go through it, sort of thing. But what is the next? What is the plan? Do you see what I mean? It's all a little bit. For me, it's just all a bit confusing sometimes, and it's like, you know, we are going through a situation, but until I start seeing a better structure to, you know, whether that's to do with the youth development, bringing us together in the way that we actually are, we have these things that we're doing today, and it's like, it's all well and good having these things, but where are they going to actually go to? Well,
you know, that's exactly why, I mean, this, you know, the research program, you know, the COVID race and ethnic inequalities program is the first of its kind. I mean, the thing is that the fact you've got, you know, all these different universities, you've got all these different partners. And I think that's the reason, and that to build on that movement, not just provide the evidence, but you have voices in unison crossing topics, because the fact that we've got you here with academics, we're looking at the culture side, but I want to come back to football or sport, but with a particular focus on football, and using Ian Wright as an example, talking about, you know, all across the piece, across sport, talking about being racially abused within their own camp, by their own fans, how it's always consistently been dealt with inadequately, the fact that the push is always from outside the institutions, you know, and the impact it invariably has, because there's a disproportionate impact on racial and ethnic minorities in this space. So you know, so for you as a Black man in who's, you know, gone through 2 different sporting careers, how does that need to be dealt with? Because what's been happening so far?
Inconsistency. It's inconsistent. There's no. Do you know what it is? Obviously, with social networks and everything, the generation that we're in right now, it's giving people a freedom to have expression and say what they want and do things. But what I'm trying to figure out is where is the actual punishment of things? Like, if someone's coming in to racially abuse a public figure, or just generally racially abuse, there's got to be like something in place that whoever's going to be doing that kind of racial, you know, interpretation of what they want to put that person under, why can't we as a system then make the punishment more, oh, actually, do you know what, I might think about being racist today because I know what could happen, sort of thing. But it's very like wishy-washy, isn't it? It's not. It's like people are continuing to be racist for whatever reasons, and nothing's really done. So what I'm saying is, can we not get into a consistency of making an example, of people that want to be recognised for being racist, and feel like it's good to do that, like some kind of fashion thing, but it's always been here, but it's getting more highlighted now because people have social network. So can they not be punished more than what has been done? Like that's my point. Do you see what I mean?
So who? I mean, I'll put this to both of you, Rachel and Leon. I know, you know, the whole thing. It's not. I'm not expecting you to have the answers. But knowing the structure that you had long careers in, who needs to be targeted? Where does the change need to happen? Because you're saying that, because in other words, about sanctions and consequences and
Yeah.
accountability, all those wonderful terms. But in the end, if you were, who would you want to sit down with today if you had the opportunity and say, this is what you need to do?
Right now?
Yeah.
Sit down with the Prime Minister.
But within sport, in terms of sport.
In sport, there's the PFA, there's FIFA, there's the PFA, there's all the governing bodies that they have the power to come together. But I don't know, Rachel, have they ever really sort of come together? It's always like, FIFA, like PFA, like it's always kind of like they look after themselves sort of thing. That's how I feel. I don't know if they collectively come together and then go, right, bang, like what can we do collectively? Don't think about the money and everything, collectively, and say, right, how can we tackle this situation collectively and not worry about protecting themselves and protecting this area and protecting that area? Do things collectively. When you collectively do things, you gain more power.
Well, this is what the research is starting point is. It's a collective, it's a coalition. I think that's being mirrored. But Rachel, if you want to answer that before bring in Marcia.
I just think it's gone too far now, and it has to be led by the government for me, because we can say it's sport, but what Leon said is spot on. It's society, so it has to be led by the government. And the sports, the governing bodies, yes, everybody's out to protect your own, because one thing, it's a business and they're making money. So whilst there's still money coming in, everybody's still happy. So for me, it's got to be the government setting a rule, setting a standard, and then making people accountable, like we've seen about, the social media sites and stuff like that. It has to, for me, I think it has to come from the government setting a stance and saying, this is how we do it in this country and this is how we want it done.
100%.
Brilliant. I just want to, we'll come back, Leon, because I want to bring in Marcia, Willis, Stewart now, but thank you both so much, Rachel and Leon. Lots to say. Thank you. I'd like to, Marcia, Willis, Stewart, QC, Honorary QC. Thank you, Marcia, for joining us today. Lots to digest.
Yes, lots.
And you're, an award-winning civil rights lawyer. You've worked on many cases, including Hillsborough, representing, over 70 plus of the families, Canberra Sands, Mark Duggan. I mean, you have been at the sharp end of miscarriages of justice. And so, I mean, what, you've said, the slow recognition, everyone you've heard, the government, but you've acknowledged the slow recognition of the government, the government's slow recognition of the disproportionate impact of COVID on ethnic minority communities, and also taken a very long time to recognise that the relationship between ethnicity and deprivation. So, and you're seeing that, you work with inquests, you're seeing that in your work. That unfortunately drives your work. And what concerns you now since lockdown? What has been coming across your desk?
Well, I just want to pick up and bring together what Rachel and Leon were speaking about and saying, that there ought to be a government response. From my perspective, the government response in terms of the legislation, the COVID legislation, has had a really negative effect. And rather than as it were, a wider public health discourse at looking at it from a public health perspective, I mean, from where I'm sitting, it's further criminalisation of individuals. I mean, if I look at stop and search, just being in London, the Metropolitan Police spoke about crime being down, yet, the Commissioner said it gave them more opportunity to stop and search. Now, and 1 in 4 stops and search led to either a caution arrest or anything else. And I think what the problem is, for example, if we speak about the police, it's one thing in terms of the role that the state, the government set for the police, but it's another when it's about the role that the police sets for itself. And I think we have seen that. So I'm glad Remi was speaking about the work that they're doing in terms of stop and search. And we know that there's a lot going on in the context of stop and search, but I think it really does need to be interrogated on a nationwide basis. So yes, I am having to deal with the illegal and unlawful stop and searches, and then oftentimes the assaults that go with that. And sadly, you know, there are still restraint deaths. Yes, but that's to do with policing. If I could turn the tables, I see in the chat that somebody was speaking about what's going to happen in summertime with our young people. And I am very, very concerned about what's going to happen during the summer months with our young people who we know are dealing with the kind of mental health issues of isolation, anxiety, starting from an early age. It's not just those at secondary school who are doing O-levels and A-levels and thinking about universities. It's little ones, and it does have an effect. There are some studies that have been undertaken by the House of Lords and Ofsted into the negative impact that COVID and the way that it's being dealt with having on children. And so I'm really concerned about our society. I mean, you know, we're talking about society now. There are those of us who are old enough to remember that there was a prime minister who didn't believe in society. My, how the tables have turned. And
also, you know, the other point I know, you know, that you're concerned about is the impact on women, many of whom have bear the brunt of responsibility for childcare, and what is happening for them and about their rights and knowing where they stand as well. I mean, again, you know, there's the pay disparity and so on. What are you aware of in that respect, particularly during lockdown?
You know, I mean, first of all, we know that there has been an increase in domestic violence, fact, not fiction. We know that there are many single parents, many of whom are women, and the issues of homeschooling. You know, how do you homeschool if you've only got one mobile phone on a contract that only gives you so much data, and you have one or two children and you've got to, you know, you run out of credit? How do you homeschool? Also, you know, children sitting in front of a computer when you're trying to actually, in a one-bedroom flat, and they're all sharing, how do you do that? How do you manage that? How do you manage that tension? And I think the truth is there are going to be severe mental health difficulties. Well, there probably are. It's not that they're going to be. We know that there are currently serious mental health difficulties for children, and indeed single parents, and even those who are not single parents, from isolation.
Now, in relation to, you know, the research program, you know, the COVID Race and Ethnic Inequalities program led by CODE, you know, there'll be empirical research, there'll be research that you and others can use in terms of the work that you do. I mean, what is it that you want to see, particularly in terms of the nature and extent of the inequalities that are being reinforced and being created at this time?
I think in my world, we often complain about, you know, as civil liberties lawyers, we're able to actually, on behalf of our clients, actually, if not get people prosecuted, we at least enable families to learn more about how their loved one or how they may have suffered. We get some truth out, but sadly, you know, the data goes into somewhere, it goes on a shelf. I mean, I will use the Camberwell fire, the Lucknow House fire. There were recommendations made following that fire where families lost their lives, which went into a drawer in the minister's desk, and then we had Grenfell, and consistently we are concerned about lessons not being learned. I think it was Claire who said, you know, we need to make this research count. And I would say we really do need to make this research and these lessons that we are having to learn count. And so I would want to see that happen.
I'd like to invite Claire and Bridget back. Thank you, Marcia. And one of the questions, with the new census coming in, this is Emma Ball, with the new census coming in March 2021, how do you think the labels for ethnicity in the census influence social, political, and economic conversations about race and ethnicity? A lovely big question for either of you to answer, even though it was to all panelists, but I think maybe I'll land it with you. Bridget.
Oh, Claire, you go.
Okay.
Yeah, go.
I was thinking, I mean, partly one of the issues is that once you label something, it constructs the object in a particular way. And I think one of the issues with any kind of categorization is it ignores, well, both diversity within that, whether you're talking about gender, social class, where people live, those kind of things, but also I think commonalities across different groups. There are a range of problems with the census. I always think of the census as kind of, when it changes, as identifying the kind of groups that the government are suddenly really interested in. But I think that's my own conspiracy theory kind of approach. But I also think it's really important, because if we don't have that baseline of data, we have nothing to kind of work with. So I think it's not a perfect tool, but I think it's better than nothing. One of the things that Code is looking at this time is the impact of the pandemic on kind of new migrants and asylum seekers. So we know there's going to be quite a lot of impact specific to those groups who have, you know, uncertain citizenship status, and particularly with Brexit and so on looming. So I think that some of those things, what constitutes the increasing category of kind of other, so that, you know, we know that category's been getting bigger, but that, you know, conflates a whole bunch of different kinds of people. And I think that the survey that we're going to be doing as part of this work will allow us to get some of the kind of granular information around that. So I think it's better to have the census than not, definitely, but I think there are issues around the categorization.
Right, there's another question here. Beresford, thank you. Acknowledges that research is critical in informing, influencing, and evidencing change. No question. What he finds frustrating is, or one criticism, indeed frustration, often levied against academics and research, is that there's a disconnect between research and practical impact. You know, you can list, you know, the government's race disparity audit and so on. So evidencing race inequality and pointing to recommendations to address this across various sectors. But again, as I pointed out, it's been mentioned about 3 times in the discussion about how on earth do then we get these, not just get the recommendations implemented, but sustained. What is the way forward? What's built into this project, or needs to be built into this project, for that to shift that unhelpful narrative and experience?
I mean, that's a key struggle, isn't it? Because as someone I think said in the comments, what the pandemic revealed about inequalities was nothing new to those of us who research in this area and to people's lived experience. But so the key is how you achieve change. And in fact, we produced a report just recently with the Stewart Hall Foundation, where we summarised the last 10 years or so, or longer than 10 years of recommendations that have been put to the government by various different inquiries around race and ethnic inequalities. And in a sense, you just think, well, if they just implemented those, we'd be off to a good start. So it's a challenge to us as researchers who are really committed to achieving that kind of change, how we do it. And we have to acknowledge that we're limited by the receptiveness of the government. We can't get the politicians we might like all the time. But I do think that we're in a particular moment at this time, with the conjunction of the pandemic, the recognition of the inequalities. I mean, they were covered in the media in a way that I've never seen before. as well as Black Lives Matter, where there's a real widespread kind of mobilization of a desire to get change. So I hope that we're at a pivotal moment where we can achieve something more than perhaps research has in the last 10 years, perhaps, because we have, honestly, as academics, we've struggled to get engagement with some key people who are able to make the change. But I have some optimism. I'm not always the most optimistic person, but I have some optimism that this is a moment where change can be achieved, and that there is a new generation also coming up who are making this more of a, really sharp political issue that matters. But I guess just to reflect on what some of the speakers were saying, I think what's really struck me over what people were saying was also about how we have to think about this as both what is the impact of COVID and the pandemic, but also what needs to be done in the recovery. In order to understand what people need to get that recovery, we need to have a good understanding of the impact. And I think that's the thing that will drive us forward is, well, how do we recuperate some of the losses that have been experienced during the pandemic?
I just want to also amplify that the whole project is intersectional. And that's very important to stress. I think sometimes, I take that for granted because to me, it's the norm, but it's important to stress that and opportunities to explore identity as well. And as we've mentioned, social class. And there's a question that's just come up in the chat. And then I want to bring in Marcia actually as well. Because of a point that she's raised and something that I did want to ask her, but I wasn't sure if we would have enough time. So Sunrise, thank you, Sunrise, said, will both rural experiences and challenges be included? So urban, rural. Anyone? Claire? Bridget? Speak to that.
I have to admit, most of the projects are, they're focused on, the qualitative ones are focused on the urban, but that's not exclusively. For instance, we've got a project looking at the experiences of older people and how they've experienced the pandemic, and that's quite widespread geographically. But also that's part of the survey that's going to be talked about tomorrow. That's part of the kind of design of it, is that where surveys have interviewed ethnic and racial minorities and religious minorities, they tend to be focused on the urban areas because they're kind of easier to find there. But the methodology of this survey is to really reach beyond those kind of usual communities. And so we're very aware that if you look at the demographics, that ethnic minorities are living all over the country, and we need to have an understanding of all of those experiences. So yeah, there is a push to understand those, and we will be, to a certain extent, at least within the survey and some of the projects, looking at those rural experiences, which I think are very different often.
I just want to bring Marcia back just to speak to a question and a point. I've quoted you before saying, that the importance of the research and what we've just said here about how do we take it beyond, with a resistant government who's got a skewed perspective in relation to race, racism, institutional racism, ethnic inequalities, but yet pushing out the mantra that we're all in this together. And that is, that as far as you're concerned, that's an illusion. So how then do we, because that's another layer, perception, that we have to break through too. So what do you think needs to happen?
I do think that I'm hopeful, and I have to be positive, or I wouldn't do what I do, and hope that the empirical evidence will come out of this, which will show, prove, expose the degree of inequality and dislodge the mantra that we're all in it together. Yes, of course, COVID is no respecter of persons. However, we're not all experiencing it in the same way. And because of the, all of the inequalities that we've spoken about, I think it's important to, if we are thinking, as Claire touched on, about the necessary recovery, I think we really do have to look at what comes out of this research, which will then lead us into realistic recovery plans, because they won't all be the same. And come out we will, and recover we need to. And that has to be, and the recovery is absolutely generational, intersectional, and necessary. My gosh, doesn't that feel like an opportune moment to end? But I can't, because there's people I've got to thank. Marcia, thank you so much. I would like to, so Marcia, if I just bring Remi back now, I'm just, as we start winding up, thank you all so much for your questions and your comments. We'll save them and we'll respond to some of them on our social media platform. So I just want to thank Claire, Remi, I like your cup. I fancy a cup of tea now myself. And Bridget, thank you all and good luck with the research, and looking forward to working with you on that. I'd also like to thank our guest speakers, Leon, Alba, Marcia, and Rachel. Thank you all so much. And Rachel, Alba, Leon, just before I sign you off, is there anything else you want to add at all?
No, just thank you to everyone that has spoken today. Very intellectual and very well put across. I've learned a little bit from an educational point of view, because for myself, I don't have all the answers, but I definitely know that we have certain issues within, ethnicity, culture, and everything that comes with it. And I think when you get the likes of yourselves all coming together and speaking, it gives people the opportunity who don't maybe have a profile as such to ask the questions that need to be asked, because Wisconsin sometimes falls into the category of people that generally have profiles and they're the only ones that you hear, but there's so many other people with intelligent resources and answers that aren't heard, and we need to hear that.
Another good point. Look at this. It's like a movie when you have like how many endings. That's another ending. But nice. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Leon, Alba, Rachel. And also thanks goes out to Nakisai and Teo for your sterling work as BSL interpreters. Thank you all so much. And also to Jennifer Igiri, our tech moderator behind the scenes. And just quickly, before we go back to our daily lives, we will be, as Bridget and Claire has already mentioned, be launching a huge survey, the first and largest of its kind. Find out more. If you go to Ethnicity UK and find out there, or search for Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity on Eventbrite to sign up, because there's still tickets for you to join us tomorrow between 11:30 and 12:45. Also, please, anything that's come out of this that you want to share with others, please use the hashtag COVID Race Inequalities. And we will connect with you that way as well. And I also just want to name check the 10 universities who are, partners in this project. The University of St Andrews, obviously being led by the University of Manchester, Goldsmith University of London, the University of Sussex, King's College London, London School of Economics, UCL, Manchester Metropolitan University, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of Glasgow. So join us tomorrow when Gary Young will be chairing that event. And until then, thanks again and stay connected. Goodbye.